Bubble Smack. Alright, today I want to just go over some things, kind of make a good simple lesson video. And the question is creationism the true historical science? Now, this is for those of you who may be kind of new, and you may hear things from a newer atheist community that's very aggressive, and guys like Richard Dawkins, guys like Bill Nye, the science guy, who will make claims that evolution, from goo to you, from Big Bang here, that all this is fact, and that creationism is stupid and even dangerous. So if it's stupid and dangerous, it would be something that we shouldn't conceive. So where are they setting the bar with this? All I have to do to present this to you is to present you ideas that are not stupid or dangerous. That's the bar they set. If they want to be that aggressive, then that's basically what they're saying. And they want this to be the mainstream accepted view, and in some places, they've even gotten government aid. The government has aided in the cause of atheism. In fact, communist nations have historically, even as far along as 100 years ago, outlawed faith and pushed evolution by force of law. And even in America, you are graded on whether you know the theory of evolution, not according to how well you know the story of creation. And so I want to kind of address this. Now, let me just kind of make these points, and you just have to ask yourself, is this, the stupid and dangerous idea, or is this true historical science? Now, when we deal with historical science, it is not the same as practical science. Why is it not the same? Because practical science is about the here and now, and we can do experiments on the here and now. Historically, modern science has had modern scientific equipment, at best 200 years. Maybe certain other experiments that are cruder we've had for 400 years. And the scientific theories that we started off with Francis Bacon are about 500 years old. Well, what do we have past that? We don't have scientific experimentation. So then when we look at the past, what do? Well, we have to go by empirical evidence. And how does that empirical evidence come? Well, the first place it comes is by history. Now, when I observe things, I can go by experience. I experience things for myself, and I experience eyewitnesses. When I look to the past, I hit my 40th birthday recently. Yay, I'm freaking old! And then, I can talk to people who are old. The oldest person I ever met, going back the farthest in time, was my grandmother was a nurse at a nursing home. And I met a woman when I was about 6 years old who was about 105. So that was probably about 1986. So that would be about 1881. So my experiential knowledge would go back at best to 1881. Then I deal with other people, and they've dealt with other people on down. And the best that we can gather from history, when we go back into ancient records, goes back to genealogies. Because in genealogies, you have, well, this person father that person, father that person, father that person. We have family trees, and we can measure things that way. We have other historical stories, but they're more scattered. You have a story here, you have a story there. We owe a great deal to the scholar James Ussher, otherwise known as Archbishop James Ussher, who organized all of the ancient civilizations and their histories together. And what he found was that when we go strictly to historical knowledge, that accuracy-wise, we couldn't go much past the ancient historian Herodotus as far as pagan records. After 800 BC, then it's all scattered. And then he would organize things according to the biblical history. And the biblical history goes back about 4,500 years. Then it will swerve over into an event called the Great Flood, or the Flood of Noah. And before that, we will have a genealogy that will give us another 1,000 to 1,500 years. Archbishop Ussher had things down to where it was about 4004 BC. There are other different versions where you have like Jewish rabbis have dated a little bit shorter. Other civilizations dated a little bit shorter. The Septuagint and some of the Egyptian records go a little further, and they'll want to advance things as far back as maybe even 10,000 BC. But once again, they're not strict as far as what you can rely on with history. Now, I have a quote from a World Civilization book that says that they go back about 5,000 years as far as they can tell with history. And then after that, you're really dealing with prehistory. Okay? So the organizing principle of the biggest book that covers the most historical data would be the Holy Bible. Okay? Now, it's not to say that there's not other histories or assumes or claims or whatever, but as far as like from A to Z, that block is the Bible. It's the most historical of those different various records. Now, once we get to that, we find many ancient sources that start to agree with the Bible. And there are ancient sources that believe or have people that believe in a creator God. Okay? They might not all be monotheistic, but they might have started out monotheistic with a creator God. You can see this especially in the Chinese histories. Chinese histories go about 1,000 or 5,000 years ago, and then they, peak off with a monotheistic god named Shangdi. It's very similar to El Shaddai. In the Bible, it's a name for God, is El Shaddai. Shangdi, Shaddai. Okay. So, basically, when we get to that age, we hit a stopping point, and we have a creator God in history. Now, if you go beyond that history, what do you have to rely on? Speculation. So they'll have speculation with archaeology. I found this rock, I found this tool, and I'm going to guesstimate how it was. Then you have the speculation of anthropology. And anthropology is based on evolution. So they'll say, we assume human evolution is true, and then we'll try to organize our archaeology and our evolutionary biology. And then evolution has to function things with cosmology, which goes back to the Big Bang Theory. But all these things are theoretical. And in order to say that these are facts, what you're actually doing is you're committing a fallacy of inductive logic. Well, how does that work? Well, you can't know more than what you have evidence of. You're limited as far as knowledge goes to what you actually have evidence of. And the less evidence you have, the less certainty you have. So the sample is not necessarily the same as the population. If I took a spoon and dipped it into a pool. Let's say we had an outdoor pool, and I dipped in that pool, and I got a certain amount of marbles, say 9 blue marbles and 1 red. Does that mean that the whole pool is 90% blue marbles? Well, when we talk statistics, that's what we're kind of trying to say. We're saying, oh yeah, I took a scoop, and that will equal that. But is that the truth? Not at all. You may have the only 9 blue marbles in that whole pool. You cannot know the whole population by the size of the pool. So the greater population you have, the less certainty you have when you only have a sample. So we only have about 5,000 years of attested factual history. Everything else gets hazy, okay? That is a fallacy of induction. And so when we go back millions of years, we go back billions of years, we're really just throwing out darts. We really don't know what we're talking about. Meanwhile, the biblical history starts not long before that. They start around 6,000 years ago. Now, with the biblical history, you say, well, how do you know it's historical? Well, there was a guy, and I believe his name was James Barr. I know his name was Barr. And I'll have all this stuff written down. I don't have the equipment right now to put up a presentation, so I'll just have it all linked when I post the video. But basically, I believe his name is James Barr, and he was a Hebrew scholar. And some people wrote to him, and they asked what the Hebrew scholars thought the book of Genesis was actually teaching, okay, when it came to the story of the creation. And he said that of all the world-class universities that he knew of, and all the Hebrew scholars, he didn't know anyone who didn't hold that Genesis wasn't intending to convey that the 7 days of creation were not literal, and that they were not historical. He says that was the intent. Now, he was not a creationist. He was not talking about creationists. They all rejected creation. But they knew, as scholars of not just reading the Bible, but as Hebrew scholars, that this was intended. And what you find is the key to this is the use of a piece of Hebrew grammar that we call the vav, or the wal, or the vav consecutive. Okay, and what that means is when they were telling a story, and. When you look at the days of creation, and. These are part of telling a historical story. This is the way they talk. This is the way they thought. So when they said that, they were seriously, okay? So when I say this is factual, then somebody hears me and they'll say, hey, Matt is claiming that something is historically accurate and true and factual. Okay? So basically just the same. This is the intent of the authors. So this was a historical record that God had created at that time. Next, we look at the earth. The theories of cosmic evolution, where not only do we have the creation through the Big Bang, okay, or the existence of the universe through the Big Bang, if I can try to put it in an atheistic way, that when we look at the earth was, according to the Big Bang Theory, descended from a star. And it would have been a hot lava material that was spat out from the star, okay, that was full of fusion and radioactive like a star. And that slowly the gravity would collect dust and build up. And of course, being that it would be that hot, there couldn't be any water, because the water would eventually turn into mist and vaporized. And so the earth would have been hot and molten, but it would not be watery. And it would be dry of water, because all that water would escape such extreme temperatures. But the Bible, in the story of Genesis, says that the earth was formless and void, and that the Holy Spirit hovered across the great deep, and through the midst of the waters, everything was wet. We had a wet earth. Now, we have found much evidence for that wet earth. Seismologists have made discoveries through their measurements of the earth, and having certain shifting and vibrations, they've found waves up to 400 miles underneath the earth. They have also dug the earth's deepest hole, or at least at that time the deepest hole, the Kola hole in Russia. And that Kola hole, when you went down about, I think it was about 13 miles deep, okay? 13 miles into the earth, this giant hole, you would find that water would irradiate out of the rocks, okay? And so they would have this radioactive water there showing that the earth was wet. But how could it be wet? Not only did you have the heat, but you had the weight, okay? Thousands and thousands of tons, okay, over this area. Would not give them, there was too much pressure and too much heat for any water to stick around there, especially not billions of years. They also have found that one of the biggest materials of dirt, called wadzilite, had, I think it was 0.02% water in it. And this 2% water, if you added all the mega tons of wadzilite all over the earth, equated to about 36 oceans worth of water. And not only that, but in the lava that they found, which comes from deep underneath the earth. Okay, when the lava comes out, they've done some different experiments on the lava, and they found a watery substance called deuterium in the lava. And so what we have deep within the earth is water, and plenty of water, by the way. Now, that in itself says creationism bing, okay, evolution zing. And by the way, when I talk of the history, we also have to mention that God is mentioned in Genesis as a historical character, that people had eyewitnesses, okay? You had Adam and Eve, you had the snake, they're all talking to God in the garden. And yet God also talks to Cain and Abel and other Bible characters throughout history. And we learn these things about God. And what do we learn about God? God is eternal. God is immutable. That means he's unchanging. God is all-knowing. That means he's omniscient. God is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. Okay? And God is everywhere. Okay? He's not like a little ghost that wanders around. There might be a spirit of God that moves across, okay, in space and time. But God is also transcending space and time, okay? So when we look at this, and we have to understand the rationality of God, not only do we have witnesses of God as a fact, but God, if he does not exist, what would he be? Well, if he did not exist, he'd say, well, he's a figment of the imagination. He's a myth. But is a myth all-powerful? No. Is a myth all-knowing? No. Is a myth eternal? No. Is a myth immutable? No. Is a myth loving and holy? No. Anything about God is not what a myth is. Okay? And so then when we're speaking of God, and God has been observed, he cannot be the myth. Then what can God be? Well, you could say, well, God is totally ununderstandable. But then we have a whole field of science that was once called the field. We have a field of science that was once called the queen of the sciences, and that's called theology. Thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of people have gotten degrees from government-accredited universities in doctorates and PhDs in the field of theology. And that means they understand the concept. Even people who reject God, atheists, they have to understand God in order to reject God. So you have a rational concept that's been historically observed. Now, one thing that we also have to understand is that there is a changing of nature. Okay, there's a before and an after of the flood, according to the narrative. And this flood was not only witnessed by the Jews, okay, but virtually every ancient civilization has a record. And there are primitive peoples in every continent that have legends of a great flood or a watery beginning and a character like Noah, okay, who saved civilization out of their boat, okay. They have stories of this in China. They have stories of this in Australia, in Africa, in South America, in the Polynesian Islands, in Canada, and the Native Americans, just everywhere. All these legends. There's been a count of 260 of them. There's been other wider accounts that go up to 600, okay? Probably just depending on how they categorize things. But nevertheless, if there was a great flood, it affected all of civilization. Because all of civilization is talking about it. Not just one locality. Now, the alternative is that we have a geologic column according to evolutionists or uniformitarians. That's another label they like to do. They like to do the don't label me, so you got 1,000 different labels, but it's all part of the same process. Nevertheless, they argue that there's all these geologic layers, and they call it a geologic column. And when it was first proposed, it was Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell, when he proposed this, his geologic column was 100 miles deep. And yet he only thought that the Earth was 1 million years old. But he thought it was 100 miles deep, and what have we found since then? Well, when we put that column out there, you can find it all over the world on wood in textbooks. But as far as within the Earth, it's a totally different story. They have found about 20 places on the Earth that have 3 out of the 15 columns in the proper order. So out of the 15 columns, only 3 of them in 20 different places are in the correct order. Okay, not even the whole column. I think there's 1 or 2 places that have the whole column in correct order. Out of all the Earth, out of all the world in every dig. It's not good. Because the theory would state that most of the world should be in the right order. Not maybe 1 or 2. Okay? But we can still humor them. Okay? Let's just assume that this baloney is true. Now, we look at the start of life. Now, there was no good environment for the cells. There was a peer-reviewed journal on this, and it was done in 1980. It was just a couple months into the 1980. It was in 1981 that this peer-reviewed journal came out, and they had done the mathematical statistics of whether or not they could get the environment right to create a cell. They could make some liquid proteins, and when I say liquid proteins, they were not even alive, but they were the right composition of the proteins. And basically, from there, it was impossible. The odds of getting this, and this was an artificial environment, not the environment that we have, but the odds of having the environment correct just to create one cell was 10 to the 40 knots. Okay, so it was nearly impossible to get the right environment. And that environment would have to make a cell, and a cell is made of 1 trillion individual parts. Okay, an estimated 1 trillion individual parts. So that's only if you pass that 10 to the 40 knot possibility. And while you're there, guess what? When we look at the geologic column, as far back, Precambrian and before all this other life, we find these ancient bacteria. The bacteria are fully formed. Okay? That means that all the way back at the beginning of your imaginary geologic column, okay, millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, you have to have 1 trillion parts fully formed. And you have to have it in that perfect environment that's 10 to 40 knots. But for evolution to take place, they've said, and biologists have set forth this idea that macroevolution, which is what we're really talking about, the change from one kind of an animal to another, could take place in 50,000 generations. So if one gives birth to another 50,000 times, then we'll change the species. But studies in E. coli bacteria, they have had E. coli and they have done 50,000 generations of E. coli bacteria. Was the bacteria exactly the same? Well, not exactly the same. But was it still E. coli bacteria? And yes, it was. And so after 50 generations, you still didn't get it, and you still wouldn't get it out of the very, 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 very earliest of the column that we can't even prove exist. Okay? Now, as far as that environment goes, we go by this idea of natural processes. What is that? I'm doing that mock British accent. I don't know why they do. Evolution, processes. Okay, whatever. But basically, if we go by those natural processes, the ocean would be the ideal environment to create this. Could the ocean get it right? Well, guess what? The evolution has been said to be, well, that would have been 3 billion years ago. But the ocean is getting rid of salt at a certain rate. And if you go back in time, then the salt that leaves the ocean onto the beach would go back in. And if you went back 100 million years in reverse of that process, okay, you would get a solid block of salt. So now we have to somehow formulate the correct environment. It should be 1 in 10 to the 40 knots. Inside a solid block of salt. And within that, after that 1 in 10 to the 40, then you have that fun idea of trying to get 1 trillion parts together, functioning perfectly to make the machine. Okay? So then, we look at some other physics. And one thing that a lot of physicists have argued is that the Big Bang universe model is so big. Their version of the Big Bang imagines that the universe is so big that there are stars that are billions of light years away. And in order for us to get light from those stars that we see, Since they're billions of light years away, well, that would be billions of years ago. So how can you do that with 10,000 years when it's billions of years? And we start off a little hazy. We say, well, that's a distance. Okay. But here's one little problem. It's not just our problem. It's you guys. Because when we're talking about that light, the light, what we call the cosmic microwave background radiation, this light that is so many billions of years light years away from one side is also that many from the other side. And we see the light from both sides permeating both sides. So you're really talking about 30 or 40 billion years across. And yet, the Big Bang is only supposed to be about 11, 12, 13 billion. It actually lowered this year, by the way. The calculations have been going up steadily over the years. They take longer and longer and longer. But now there was a miscalculation made, and now we have to go backwards 2 billion years. Once again, it's the great thing about facts, right? Okay, so then there is a lack of antimatter. The idea of the Big Bang is how do you get the force of the Big Bang? What makes it? What is going to make that happen? Especially if there is no God. Well, I thought maybe there's an explosion between matter and antimatter. And I figured, well, that might work. So all we need to do is have as much antimatter as we have matter to make that explosion happen. Problem. We barely have seen any antimatter throughout the universe. We barely have enough to say it even exists. And yet there's supposed to be enough antimatter to create this Big Bang. We don't even have the power for the Big Bang. So then we look at the age of the universe and we assume that all this pressure and heat that builds up would create these stars. And how do we create the stars? Well, it's really a mystery. Abraham Loeb of Harvard, who's a Harvard astrophysicist, said, "We do not understand star formation at a fundamental level." So we don't know how it is that you have super freezing, negative 300 degrees Celsius ice clouds not only get hot, but get hot and have gravity, and have so much gravity in their cloud that they come together with such force that they create not only a fission, but something greater than fission, a fusion reaction. And a huge fusion reaction with lots of the giant cloud doing this to create something millions and billions of times of the planet Earth. We don't know how that happens. Okay? But we assume that these billions of stars, like each galaxy we assume is a billion stars. So there's got to be a lot of supernovas. There is not. We do not have very many supernovas. So we do not have a mechanism for the process of the stars. As if we even had an idea how that happened anyway. And when we're trying to do these measurements, what are we doing? Well, we're looking out in space and we're finding a glare of red light. And that glare of red light, we're assuming, is light leaving us. We're assuming that it operates like the Doppler effect, which is what? The way sound operates. But is sound exactly like light? No, I don't think so. Anyhow, there's about 60 or 70 theories of what's going on when we see the red shift. But we assume that the red shift is only one interpretation that they teach you. Actually, that redshift, that red light, I think the most valid interpretation would be what's called the Unruh effect, which would be that the red light is a showing of temperature. When we look at stars anyway, the color that we see the star as we consider to be a measurement of temperature. So why not be consistent? But when we go and measure these stars, according to this Doppler effect theory, we miss the mark. An astronomer named Halton Arp found these quasars. And when he would measure the quasars are visibly connected to other stars. And yet they are measured to be trillions of light years away from the stars they're supposed to be connected to. It visibly does not make any sense. So what happens? Well, it seems more to go along with that Unruh theory. Now, of course, if that's true, then we're not really having a good measurement of how far these stars are away from us, and therefore we don't really know the size of the universe. Now, how do we measure stars? Well, typically we use stellar parallax, which we use trigonometry, measuring the distance of the sun to the earth, which we found out through different shadows. And then we do trigonometry, and we go things based on the Polaris North Star, the one star that we never see move, that's always north above us too. So we start measuring things according to it, and then we're able to graph out and find the distance of other stars. But we can only go back 6,000 light years. After that, the stars are too close together to really truly measure accurately. Well, then we also had the Hubble telescope. Oh, and by the way, when it comes to that measurement, the measurement of the redshift, we start to use that afterwards, right? Well, they've checked the redshift on the Polaris North Star, and it is 100 light years difference. And so that means the whole measurement of all the different stars and their places becomes way out of whack when it comes to distance. But we've also got another tool, the Hubble telescope. This space telescope, this giant thing about the size of a bus. Okay, this telescope they used, and they've been able to zoom in better than ever before on all these different stars. Sounds great, right? They even zoomed in on a dark patch. And when they did that, they found that, the deep field. When they zoomed in on the deep field, they found stars and galaxies. But there's a little something odd about that, because when you measure distance and you see light at a distance, light always gets blurrier the farther away it is. And yet these super far away stars and galaxies were perfectly clear. Now my thing is that when you look through a telescope, look at something close, and you'll find that the objects appear bigger instead of closer. So what if, when we're using the Hubble telescope, that those objects are actually microscopic instead of far away? Maybe we're looking at cosmic space dust, radioactive molecules and things of that nature. Or even reflective objects. Okay? Pieces of glass and ice reflecting off of different galaxies, portraying a prism of different things. So the actual size of the universe, we really can't know. When we look throughout space and we start measuring the cosmic background radiation, the Big Bang Theory, which relies on this CMB, this cosmic microwave background radiation, when we look at all that radiation, we have slowly but surely, and the more accurately we look, we find a pattern. If we map out the universe properly and it comes out looking as if it were a globe, what we see is we see a loop that turns into a belt. Okay? And this belt wraps itself around the universe. And we also notice that when we look at this universe, we see all the rotation of all these galaxies going around us. And all these rotations are, I believe, counterclockwise. If I'm wrong, it's clockwise. But I think it was counterclockwise. We see all these rotating galaxies. And they're all rotating in a sequence around the universal North Pole. Okay? That is, if you take the Earth's North Pole, you go straight up into space. Okay? You see that, and there's a rotation around it. And that cosmic microwave background radiation makes a belt. The belt wraps itself around the Earth. And the rotation of the galaxies stop right at the Earth's equator. So all of a sudden we have this rotation here, and we have this right here. And it makes this axis, okay? And then in the center of the axis is the Earth. The Earth is all of a sudden at the bullseye of the universe. And yet the universe, according to what we call the Copernican principle, is supposed to be completely chaotic with no pattern, because there's no God to put a pattern to it. There's no intelligence allowed. But yet now we have an intelligence, and we have a pattern, and X marks the spot. Not to mention the life. We haven't found life anywhere else in the universe, and yet here we have all this life right here on Earth. So, we keep looking. When we look at the moon, there is a lack of moon dust. The moon has gravity. It attracts dust. The moon was supposed to, according to mathematicians, it was supposed to have about 1,300 feet of dust. Now, some of that would obviously pack down, but still, it would be just very pure dust, because the moon should be 4.6 billion years old. Well, they made the Apollo landing, and you find the giant sponge-like landing gear. And it was designed that way because they thought, hey, there's going to be this gear. Now, they did say that they did some radar work, and they believed that according to the radar, that it was solid, so they were more prepared. But then they did some more measurements, and they put some equipment down there. And this one motor came in, and it's got like a giant funnel tube on it, probably about 6 or 7 feet up, away from the generator. And it would collect the incoming dust. And over 30 years, they did the measurements. And it was collecting enough dust for 2.5 centimeters, which is exactly what was there. But that level of 2.5 centimeters would be only enough dust collected for 6,000 to 10,000 years of lunar history. Now they say, well, it's the generators attracting too much. But as I said, this tube is really stretched out away from that metal. And why are the calculations adding up properly? Okay. I mean, it wasn't like this was the only way that they knew it. Okay. They saw the dust. They calculated the dust beforehand. Then they measured the dust and found the same calculation. It's pointing to a young Earth. Or a young moon, anyway. So, let's see here. When we look, going back to human evolution in animals, They found a skeleton called the Lady from Guadalupe. It's also called Miocene Man. But the lady is a skeleton that's decapitated. It's headless. And the skeleton was found as part of, fused into a rock of limestone. And that rock was about 5 miles wide. And inside that rock is the skeleton. Well, the rock is measured 28 million years old. But human evolution says that man has only supposed to have been evolving for about 1 million or so years. That means that there is a human who didn't evolve from an ape, who didn't evolve from anything, missing link or anything like that, if you assume old Earth. Listen, the scientists fired back. Well, maybe if you measured the bones by carbon dating, you'd get a younger age. But we're young Earthers. We're down if that skeleton has got a younger age. The problem is they don't have an old age. Now, this evidence was found in the early 1800s. And it was put in the British Museum. And it was taken down and moved to the basement around the 1960s. But if you look at the famous evolution trial, the Scopes trial, you will not find any mention of the lady from Guadalupe, which would have totally destroyed any contention from science and meant that all the billions and trillions of dollars was worthless. Funny, isn't it? How things just accidentally don't happen. Alright, so then you have the Paluxy River tracks. They call them the Taylor Trail. What happened was they found these tracks beginning of the century. At first they thought they were chicken tracks of a giant chicken, but then they realized they were dinosaur tracks. And museums went crazy for these dinosaur tracks in Glen Rose, Texas. And they dug them all up. Well, then there was talk about finding human tracks, giant human tracks. And some pioneers decided they were trying to make a buck, and they forged some human tracks and said, yes, we've got them. It turned out to be false. But then they found this Taylor Trail. And a man who today is a creationist, but at the time was an evolutionist, went and looked through and dug up and unearthed more of these tracks and found that these giant human footprints were walking across, and then they intersected with giant dinosaur footprints. Now, being the fact that they unearthed tons and tons of rock, you couldn't do the fake thing anymore. In fact, they've done scientific studies since then on how the measurement of the dirt underneath the tracks is compressed. And so you couldn't just stamp on a footprint. You had to have a foot compress it down. And they've also argued, well, those are dinosaur prints. They said, well, we did some on one of those footprints, and it was dinosaurian. But several of the footprints was actually stepping on dinosaur tracks. And further, there is a track of a dinosaur footprint stepping across a human footprint. And it's obvious that the dinosaur footprint is over the human footprint. Of course, why would somebody want to make up giant human footprints anyway? Then they've also found dinosaur soft cell tissue. Mary Leakey, a famous paleontologist, found some of these from a T-Rex. And she broke down the bones and found cartilage and soft tissue. By using certain acid isotopes, she found tendons and all sorts of soft tissue. And how could soft tissue be preserved 70 million years? Well, they said, well, it's because they're unpacking with the acid. Oh, there must be iron in there. But then we go deeper, okay? Mark, I'm not forgetting his last name. Armitage. Mark Armitage is a creationist, but he worked for the University of California in Los Angeles, and he headed up a laboratory of microscopy. Well, he went down and he found in I think it was Hell Creek, he found the world's largest dinosaur, Triceratops horn. It was the world's largest Triceratops horn. It was 4 feet long. And he unearthed it. And then he put it not in acid, but he put it in water isotope. And he found soft cell tissue in the Triceratops horn. And we know that horns are not exactly soft. Okay. And yet within this horn, it still had the soft cell tissue. UCLA fired him, claiming that he was pushing religious propaganda. He did a scientific peer-reviewed journal, and they fired him for evidence. And guess what? He sued them over religious discrimination. And guess what? He won. Boom. Why did he win? Because all he had was evidence. What does that mean? That means it's evidence. And it was peer-reviewed. It was right there, soft cell tissue. And he's finding more of it, even though he has to do it totally independently now. You can look him up. And dinosaur-dragon connections. The word dinosaur has only been used for 150 years, okay, meaning thunder lizard. So ancient people would never refer to dinosaurs, but they all talk about dragons. And most every ancient civilization talks about dragons. But these historians, ancient historians, talk about the dragons factually. And you can find different things of people painting these pictures of dragons that turn out to look exactly like various species of dinosaur. One famous Welsh flag has a dragon with 1 claw. And paleontologists have found a dinosaur with 1 claw in the Welsh lands. There's also talk of an ancient Greek temple where they sacrificed a dragon. And in the ancient Greek temple, what did they find in there? They found dinosaur bones. The ancient phoenix and that Native Americans would talk about. They have paintings of the ancient phoenix. And in those cave paintings, they also find fossils of pterodactyls. All these connections. When it comes to the columns, the assumption is that with all these different stacks of columns, it takes millions and billions of years. In 1981, Mount St. Helens erupts. The rocks cried out. And paleontologists looked at the new stacks and said that they would assume, if they had not seen it before, that this would have been 600 million years of column. But they have videotape. It was brand new. Also, they found many trees buried in these columns, and that was one of the ancient evidences that Charles Lyell used of trees with these different layers of column on them. It's like, oh, well, the layers must have took millions of years to form. They don't have to. Okay, catastrophes like floods or volcanoes can create stacks of dirt. Plutonium halos, not plutonium. polonium halos that have been found in granite. Granite's considered the ancient primordial rock of the earth. And in these ancient primordial rocks, they would have these polonium halos. The polonium is a radioactive element, and it would leak out all around it this golf ball size ash from radioactive burning inside the rock. And yet the rock itself is not radioactive. But these elements would form inside. And a polonium takes only a few seconds to burn, and then it's gone. Well, according to the Earth evolution theory, the Earth would have taken 1 billion years to go from a lava to a granite-like state. And they never figured out how to make granite, by the way. So we don't even know how to artificially do it. But they said it'd take billions of years. Well, if it took 1 billion years, then that 20 seconds, just like an Alka-Seltzer pill, all that radiation bubbling out, all that air bubbling out of the Alka-Seltzer, how can you freeze that if it takes 1 billion years to freeze? No, it would have been gone. It would have dissipated. It would have been out of there. And yet it captured it. And it captured it in places near the uranium. The uranium is said to take billions of years because they believe it started out, what was it? Let me make sure I get it right, because I'm trying to remember which one's heavier. This is the uranium boils down to lead. And you say, well, it would take, all lead used to be uranium. But that's an assumption. In fact, it's based on assumptions from a meteorite. Because they would say, well, the Earth is just like a meteorite. Well, only if you believe in cosmic evolution. So that's what? Circular reasoning. But they assumed it did. They assumed it took this long. And therefore, this uranium was taking that long. But the polonium is right there. Only took an instant. Flashed, freeze right then. Meanwhile, the uranium also has these pockets of helium. And the helium dissipates into the air. Well, there's still too much helium still there in these uraniums. So what's going on there? Basically, they believe that from those measurements of the helium, the Earth could only be 6 million years old. No, sorry, 6,000 years old. So after that, all the helium would be gone. It says, when we look at the Earth has an electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field is decreasing over time. So if you go backwards at times, then the electromagnetic field would have been stronger. If you go back 10,000 years, then it would have been too hot for there to be any life. And then it would have been 20,000 years, and the Earth would have been that fireball. So that destroys the theory of evolution. And many other age theories. Book of Job. I believe it's in chapter 26. The earth stands upon nothing. How did they know it 4,000 years ago that the earth stands upon nothing? In 2 Peter, it talks about how there will be scoffers in the end times, distrusting in the flood, saying, oh, the flood never happened. Why? Because God held them accountable. Well, now we have scoffers, and they said, oh, the flood never happened. Thousands of years ago, already predicted that. The life cannot come from non-life. Louise Pasteur figured that out. Generation didn't work. The earth does not make living things. You cannot get a dead thing to make a living thing. Sorry, Frankenstein. The Ernst Haeckel said that if we don't have spontaneous generation, then we have to believe that there was a miraculous creation by God. There's no other alternative. Said that in the 1800s, assuming that we would find something. We did not. The atheism is a philosophical term, but there is a religion called humanism. It is officially recognized. Those who call themselves atheists and evolutionists are actually fitting in the paradigm of humanism. They have a belief, and they believe in these scientists because they are representatives of humanity, and they believe in humanity, and therefore they have faith in it, a faith system, a religious system. And therefore, they have no right to be imposed. Humanism has no right to be imposed upon other religions. Big Bang came from a religious concept. George Lemaitre, who developed the Big Bang Theory, was a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest. But when he cites cosmic egg, he actually gets that from Hindu mythology of a cosmic egg that gave birth billions of years ago, that a cosmic egg that gave birth to all the gods who created all the universe. Just like Big Bang. It's a religious concept. So trillions of dollars are used against us. Okay? And there is no objectivity to this. Ernst Haeckel, he made a fraud. He made drawings of embryos that were purposely made to look exactly alike, even though they were not factually what the embryos look like. Haeckel's drawings were a fraud, and yet they were put in public school textbooks decades later. Piltdown Man. Also, it's been stated that it might be coming from another Jesuit. The one who came up with theistic evolution, the Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. It's been claimed, because he was the early popularizer, that he was part of this fraud. Piltdown Man was eventually found out to be an orangutan jaw with copper wiring connecting it to a human skull cap. Yet it was subject to peer-reviewed journals and put into public textbooks. I have seen mention of this in public textbooks in my middle school education back in 1991. This fraud's used to propel, to tip the scales, to give you this image. When we look at the past, we know that creationists have discussed how the ancient past before the flood was much different nature. Same physics, same scientific law, but a different nature. That the earth was covered, the waters were hovering above the waters, and those waters were ice, and they formed a film that we call a canopy, which created more oxygen. We have two forms of evidence of this. Oxygen found in ancient digs. Ancient amber containing extra oxygen in its air pockets. Ancient Arctic ice in these ice sheets with extra oxygen in the air pockets. And also hovering below or above, depending on your perspective, but hovering above the Antarctic space clouds, ice space clouds, just like what we would see in a canopy. Perhaps the last vestiges of the ancient canopy before it shattered and used as part of the Great Flood of the 40 days, 40 nights rain. And ultimately, the Arctic and Antarctic and the Ice Age all coming from the canopy that was then shattered. But this extra oxygen then providing and explaining why we have such giant fossils, because we had a richer paradise before the flood. So we had a greater nature, and we had more gigantic animals and plants because of more fruitful environment. Let's see here. Lots of anomalies about cosmic stuff. I know this video is getting long, so I'll try to keep that down for another day. Actually, you could check out my series that I've already done, and that is New Year's Cosmology class, where I explain the universe. It's a 13-hour program, but it's pretty good. No intermediate species. What they usually do to prove evolution is how one breed goes into another breed, and they stretch out the word species. So it's kind of like if I said that my yard is independent, so now I'm in the state of Singleton, inside the state of Kentucky. Well, I made a new state. Well, no, you just broke it down. Okay, and so that's basically what's going on there. They break it down so that they say, oh, well, these things are connected. Well, of course, they were always connected. Same kinds. Okay, well, there's a dog kind, but it doesn't mean that the dog became a cat or the cat became a dog. Irreducible complexity. You know, when we talk about evolution, you may say, well, this thing evolved and that thing evolved. And organs really have to evolve independently. How can there be all of it evolving unless there's a design to the whole thing? If there's a design to the whole thing, then there has to be a designer. There has to be an idea. If there is no designer, then every organ independently has to evolve. How does that work? Our bodies are complete systems. You look at the one that's really popular is the intricacy of the eye. You can't accidentally get an eye. Eyes are so incredible with how they can sense motion and distance and color just over and over again. When we look at that, materialism says that our brain is ultimately chemicals. We are nothing but a chemical reaction. Well, how can you trust a chemical reaction? It's just chaos. So then you're just chaos, and there is no order. And so why would I trust your brain? Your brain is just a bunch of chemicals firing off. Maybe it's accurate, maybe it's inaccurate. Who's crazy? Who's sane? Ooh. I've heard that before. The fact is, though, is that the mind comes up with ideas that it doesn't get from the environment. And that breaks the entire materialism paradigm. There was a fella on the internet, a neurologist, who got a disease while he was in Israel that shut his brain down. And he went into a coma. And his neurologist did all these studies on him. And while he was in that coma, his brain did not function. They just assumed he was dead. When he awoke, he had gigantic visions that he wanted to explain to people. And all the places and things and the colors and the sensations that you would never imagine. It would take so much brain activity to color out the universe that he saw. But there was no brain activity. How could he have all this information with no brain activity? because his mind was different than his brain. His mind was in a different place. How is it that you can look around the woods and come up with calculus? Or the internet? Or calculus? Or did I say it twice? No. Basically, these ideas, these complex ideas, are not part of nature. They are not material. And we have lots of immaterial concepts, like morals, like justice. Those are not material things that you get from a material world. Why should I not lie to somebody? Why should I respect other people? Yeah, I can make a government which tells people to, but why would it matter when the government's not around? And the last thing is that the universe is supposed to be running on, according to the theory of relativity, it's supposed to be based on this constant speed of light that we can map the universe, that we can know things. Well, peer-reviewed journals done calculations, and the speed of light has been measured for the last several hundred years. And the speed of light keeps on decreasing. Maybe at microscopic levels we don't notice, but it's decreasing. And therefore, the speed of light is not a constant. They've even slowed down light particles in the past. They've even seen light particles teleport. That a light particle will teleport about 15 kilometers. Well, with these things, we can't truly know light. We can't truly measure physics. We really don't know the universe. So we have to start thinking about things we don't know. And this is just a basic summary of why I believe that creationism is the true historical science.